Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone, this morning to our first morning session this Saturday morning. The topic I'm going is rehashing an area that all of us probably are familiar with, the Catholicism of Flannery O'Connor. But today, instead of repeating everything that we've already studied about her, I'm going to approach it from an angle that is particularly Londonian or relevant to our culture here. Now, when comparing Flannery O'Connor to her European contemporaries, there are a number of names that we can think of that match her style, her subject matter, even her religiosity of this century or previous centuries. It would make sense to compare her with. But here at a conference in London, amongst Fordham Catholic University, with an Anglican speaker, Anglican priest, there's only one name that makes sense for me to speak on, and that is Charles Williams. Now, Charles Williams is the oddest inkling. He was the gentleman who was alongside Tolkien and Lewis at Oxford. But unlike Tolkien, who focused on Middle-earth and the earthly battle, or Narnian's Lewis's Narnia, that focused on the heavenly battle, our friend Charles Williams focused on the descent below. His literature was not heavenly, but hellish. And so for that, we have a comparison of Flannery and Charles Williams. So both Flannery O'Connor and Charles Williams share a deep affinity for the figure of the freak. Again, another reason why it's appropriate for me to speak this morning. Both in their fiction and among their literary followers, freaks abound. Each in their own way stands as a Catholic voice in a predominantly Protestant culture. That is, Williams as the intellectual heir of John Henry Newman, that is, St. John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman of the Tractarian English Catholicism, passed down his theological legacy through the Oxford School, Keble, the Tractarians, and recipient like Charles Williams. So he is a Catholic in the Protestant tradition inside the Church of England. But then in the O'Connor school, in Flannery O'Connor, she is a Roman Catholic, surrounded as she would be as the 1% Catholic population of Georgia, amongst the do-it-yourself, individualistic Protestantism that existed in her period. So we have one who is a Catholic amongst a Protestant nation, inside of a Protestant church. We have another one who is a Catholic amongst a Protestant state and a Protestant culture. And you can see it showing up in their literature. So it's very appropriate to have a conference called Flannery Abroad in London, where we compare London's greatest Gothic and George's greatest Gothic, or as we'll use today, Grotesque. Now, they approach the world from different angles, opposite angles. One on the opposite side of the Atlantic, but also from different genders and different social worlds. O'Connor was a woman of the rural American South. Williams grew up here, a city boy in London, so poor that he was not able to pay to finish his own university degree and had to work his way up as an author with Oxford University Press as a copywriter. But even though they are different, their fictions centered around the transformative power of the grotesque. That is, grotesque defined as what is repulsive, what is ugly, and most importantly, what is distorted, is what we understand grotesque to be. Now, we've heard this word over and over and over again. It's a common trope used in describing Flannery O'Connor. But here, today, we're going to use their untraditional stories of redemption and focus on the fact that they do not resolve passively. One of the problems with reading religious texts like Flannery O'Connor is to see Flannery as an authoritarian narrator who forces her morality on top of her characters. But what we'll see in comparing these two is that there are perspectives of the characters themselves that guide the narrative, and that there is a careful tension or dialogue between the authority of Flannery, or the authority of Williams, and the grotesque character's own internal struggle and perspectives, giving the characters who receive grace a bit of agency, and they're not forced into Flannery or Williams' call of grace, a type of God-in-the-box type of transformation. They choose, in their grotesque state, to experience grace. Now, today, there's a few things I'd like to do in the short time we have. First, I want to define what unites their ideas, and that is medieval spirituality. We're going to get to a definition for that. Secondly, I'm going to show and draw out a Christological, that is, from Christ, basis for understanding the grotesque, its suffering, and how Christ understands ugly suffering being transformative. So straight from the cross, we'll go through that. Third, we're going to explore William's descent into hell, which I have right here. Wonderful book with wonderful covers. If you haven't read it, it's important to read. And then his doctrine of co-inherence. You might have heard of co-inherence in the writings of C.S. Lewis. This is the doctrine of substitution of pain. So some of you know the story of Joy, C.S. Lewis's wife, who was diagnosed with late-stage bone cancer that spread throughout her breast and her body. Very painful. The doctrine of co-inherence, as we'll discover and talk about, is the idea that C.S. Lewis believed he could bring the pain of his wife out from her onto himself. A substitution, co-inherence. So we'll go through that. And then finally, we're going to reread the story of Hazel Motes through these ideas, particularly what does the doctrine of co-inherence, what does Williams give us as a type of timeline or structure to reread Flannery's work, kind of like how we would apply different types of filters, whether it was a Marxist filter or a feminist filter. We're going to put a medievalist filter on top of Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, using particularly the Arthurian legend that Charles Williams loves to bring out. So first, let us define medievalism. Now, for a full definition, we have Father Damien's book right here. He goes through page by page the Aristotelian categories, what makes medieval. So if you would like to read the Hillbilly Thomist, it is worth understanding, because we don't have enough time to go through the entire 7 centuries of medieval philosophy to explain how we get to the Hillbilly Thomist herself. Suffice to say, she called herself a 13th century Catholic, and she believed in a version of Catholicism that was dominated by the thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas, or who she called Saint T. The medieval mind primarily saw this world, and the definition that we need to have in our mind is sacramental. The presence of God being infused into every little bit of matter. Think of the cathedrals. This is how we see the medieval worldview in action, where the Holy Eucharist is consecrated, that is, the body and blood, the soul and divinity, was meant to be a microcosm of what was happening in every bit of the rest of creation. Just as Christ came in and was transmuted through the body and blood, so was he done through their beautiful buildings, through their beautiful music, through the light of the very stained glass. The cathedral was a picture of a little bit of heaven transforming the nature of earth, of creation, of matter. The medieval Catholic sitting in his cathedral believed that he was surrounded by an army of interceding saints that heard their prayers and came down and was involved in their daily life. That they were surrounded by interceding angels that helped them in their days. That this world was permeated by the divine into the ordinary. That the supernatural was so tied to the nature that it could not be separated. Therefore, for the medieval, the Christian life was not an escape from the world, but a participation in the divine world here and now. This is the type of worldview that shapes Williams and O'Connor. Can I participate in the divine now? For Aquinas, grace does not destroy or bypass this natural world. Even the bespoiled, ugly, broken, discarded pieces, the freakish parts of this world, are elevated. Everything is transformed. Even the broken and wounded and the grotesque is infused with grace in a way that it participates in the divine. Now, important to this idea is Julian of Norwich, and her mystical view in the revelations of divine love. This particular word, love, is going to be important for us because it's central to understanding Hazel Motes. It's important for us to understand Charles Williams and his character, Peter Stanhope. But the definition of love given to us has to be seen through this Christological lens that the mystic Julian, who was an anchorite, female monk, in Norwich, not too far from here. Again, another important English figure. In Revelation of the Divine Love, which is considered to be a great work not just of English Catholicism, but of all Catholicism, she writes of the wounds that she asks for from the Lord. She prays for the Lord to wound her. She says this, "Moved by this, I conceived a great longing, praying our Lord God that he would grant me 3 wounds in my lifetime. That is to say, the wound of contrition, the wound of compassion, and the wound of an earnest longing for God. So her definition, this medieval mystic definition of love, is combined with the idea of wounding, which makes sense to us because the wounds in his hands, the wounds in his side, the wounds in his crown of thorns. In Julian's mystical view, woundedness is not a defect, which is how we tend to think. A birth defect is a wound in the womb. Disfigurement, losing a finger, an eye. These ideas of woundedness see us as separate from the divine, outside of divine protection. But in the medieval worldview, woundedness is not a deficit, but the very means exact by which divine love takes hold of us and moves us along our spiritual journey. God uses woundedness to move us on the path of salvation. This is, of course, the main premise of the Divine Comedy, where Dante presents the human soul along a pilgrimage, visiting first the wounded through sin and suffering in hell, and moves up through the ascent from hell to purgatory. Pilgrimage through suffering, an ascent of purification, where the woundedness is being built or pushed away through purgation. And then, of course, his epic vision of redemption, the top of the ascent from Dante being heaven, a vision of paradise. Now, that's a very simplified version of medieval history, but I'm sure you all have heard all these things before. So just an idea that this is the definition that we're working through. So moving to the second point, if we have a definition of what medievalism, and that this is shared by Williams, shared by O'Connor, how did they work it into their vision of Christ? Because as we read O'Connor, it doesn't feel like a very Christian book. In fact, speakers I've heard today say, who is the Christ figure? And nobody quite fits as a sinless Christ. You can see Christ-like actions in these people, but none of them are really Christ. And it becomes a problem for us to put these genres together. Yet, if we change our definition of grotesque, or allow a medieval definition of Christ to prevail on our reading, it changes. The man who is in pilgrimage in Dante is not alone. St. Anselm of Canterbury, another local English saint, right? St. Anselm of Canterbury, in Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, explains that this help of the flesh moving in this divine pilgrimage comes from above. The Quicumque Vult, or the Athanasian Creed, describes that Jesus himself, when he becomes incarnate, is not by the conversion of the Godhead into flesh, but by taking manhood into God. That Jesus' manhood is participating in the divine. It's not a lowering, but a rising up of human identity. To say it another way, for our Protestant friends, it's sanctifying. For our Eastern friends, it's theosis. For our other friends, it's a type of deification of this material world. The incarnation, or God became man, and the atonement, which is famous in Anselm's work of a substitution of one for another as the payment of sin, show that salvation itself was not an escape from the grotesque or the disordered, but rather a working through of the violence of sin, suffering, and death. Now, the figures of grotesque literature are not much different from those in Christ's own ministry. There's a wonderful figure here that makes sense of Christ's ministry. If you take his actions through the Gospels, our Lord walks through. He claims the power and authority of the divine, and he puts together a new man. He heals one person's eyes. He gives another person back their ability to speak. He gives one person their ears. He gives one person back their ability to walk. He cures one person's skin. Step by step, Jesus takes the grotesque deformity of human nature and puts them back together until after the cross, he puts the whole body back together. Do you see that? It's like a Mr. Potato Head of Jesus there. He goes and finds little pieces, puts it back together, and at the end, it is together. This grotesque is part of making it whole. But in between the death and the resurrection, an often overlooked theology is that of the harrowing. And that's where William's descent into hell is important. The harrowing of hell is what we say in the Creed is he descended into hell. The day we celebrate called Holy Saturday, where Christ goes to liberate the souls in hell. Medieval art and theology often depict Christ breaking open the gates of hell, grasping Adam and Eve by the wrists and pulling them up to freedom. Now, this cosmic act shows that no realm, no matter how dark or how grotesque, no gate, no power of sin lies beyond the reach of divine mercy. But it also comes with another sign. Christ, as he brings people up from the dead, from hell, from destruction, from suffering, brings with them his own wounds. When Christ appears to St. Thomas, he does not come purified in his flesh, but coming and bringing the grotesque marks in his side and his hands, showing that the suffering and the purification was accomplished through this work. The stigmata are our participation in the divinization of humankind. The stigmata are the man-made things that go to heaven. The stigmata picture a Christological basis for the grotesque. Now, I'm borrowing, of course, here from Marshall Bruce Gentry, who published Religion and the Grotesque, and he shows that in O'Connor's work that grotesque is the path towards redemption. Suffering is the path towards redemption. And this is exactly how the biblical narrative, which we describe through incarnation and harrowing, works. I run a grammar school. In my next school, I want to name, Church of the Harrowing of Hell. That would be a great one. No, but here, let's move quickly through William's Descent into Hell. This is the name of William's novel, Descent into Hell, where the divine love that inspires the harrowing of hell translates into human relationships. The medievals often use sexual or erotic love to metaphorically describe the human soul's intense desire for love. For example, Catherine of Siena spoke of her mystical marriage with Christ, and the courtly love of the medieval troubadours continued with suffering and devotion that worked together to inflame true and elevated forms of love. Now, in this medieval tradition, we have the legends of Arthur. The Arthurian traditions, like the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Its intensity, its secrecy, its suffering epitomizes this medieval idea where pain and love are inseparable. Right? Their love purifies them and ennobles them precisely because it demands both sacrifice and restraint. Now, Charles William draws on this tradition, but transforms it through his doctrine, as I described, of co-inherence, or based on this mystical tradition in the readings of St. Paul's words in Galatians 6, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. This is what Lewis was attempting to do with his wife. Bear her burdens, bear her pain. And so Williams practiced this in his daily life, and he gives it to his characters. For Williams, true love is not simply the endurance of longing, but the active bearing of another's burden, a mystical solidarity where lovers are not bound by possession, but by a selfless gift. He recasts the suffering of Lancelot and Guinevere into a redemptive pattern, where love fulfilled through sacrifice mirrors even the divine coherence of the Trinity itself, where love fulfills sacrifice. Now, this was a practical tool for Williams, who believed he can carry the pain of those who broke their legs or were sick. In Descent to Hell, Williams connects the past and the present through this idea. He has a play and some characters in the play who are connected to the reign of Queen Mary, and a martyr who dies in this particular period, is celebrated in this particular town. His suffering is brought to the present through a present character named, the ancestor's name is Dombey, the current character's name is Lester Furnivall. And here, the living presence of what happens now is connected to the deaths that happened back then. And the death that happened hundreds of years ago is brought to the present reality or the present fortune of the people there. So as to say, your fears could be overcome, your power is present here because what somebody did hundreds of years ago. And this idea of substitution and salvation across time is connected to their Anglo-Catholic view of the Eucharist. Christ, who was crucified at Calvary, brings his love now present to us in his ever-present sacrifice. Now, this idea is connected and bears the idea of substitution in a way that the grotesque memory, a martyrdom long ago, can be brought to bring pleasure, joy, peace, grace to the present. The solidarity of human culture, peoples from before and now, work together. There's a knitted together society, according to Williams, that is not just the people individual, but the people now and yesterday, the saints of tomorrow. All of them are bound together by this doctrine of coherence. And so if we read Wise Blood this way, If we read Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood through the lens of medievalism, through Arthurian legend, and this doctrine of coherence, Hazel Motes comes through differently. For example, we can read him as a quixotic knight. That he is somebody who comes on a wonderful quest. Think of him searching for the Holy Grail. Except his grail is his church identity. See, for us to read this in a slightly different way, Hazel Motes is driven by a sense of mission, but not yet revealed his true object of faith. His creation of the church without Christ is a dark parody of what Williams would describe as a medieval grail quest, a search not for the holy, but for the truth, for purpose, for connection. Now, where the Grail Knights sought union with God through purity and sacrifice, here Hazel Motes is looking through it at the exact opposite. This foil perspective that in prostitutes and false prophets and false churches, he can find the opposite grail. Now, this is, of course, how Flannery tells the story backwards. In chapter 3 of Wise Blood, Flannery writes this: "Sweet Jesus Christ crucified," Hazel said, "I want to tell you people something. Maybe you think you're not clean because you don't believe. Well, you are clean. Let me tell you that. Every one of you people are clean, and let me tell you why I think it's because of... let me tell you why. If you think it's because of Jesus Christ crucified, you're wrong. I don't say he wasn't crucified, but I say it wasn't for you. Listen here. I'm a preacher myself, and I preach the truth." Now, he presents himself as an alternative sacrifice of a new history, of a new person, a new grail. And to bring this all back to a close, I want to ask one question and end with a final illustration. Anyone here know what you call the little spots that grow on potatoes are? Little spots that grow on potatoes. What are those called? Eyes. Eyes, yeah. And of course, eyes are a key and important image in the story of Wise Blood. At the end, he does this whole edible thing where he gouges out his eyes. But what we have to say about the lime in the eyes is connected to what happens at the very beginning of the story when his grail quest begins. He runs into the store, or the marketplace, in the street. There's a man out there set up a little pyramid altar with potato peelers. And the potato peelers make the potato white. Right, this is the idea. And he wants that whiteness. He wants that purity. He peels that purity. There's lots of discussion on price and economy and all these things. But the idea is peel the skin, reveal the white, reveal what is true underneath the potato. This is, of course, what the medieval wants to do. Peel the exterior, sanctify, deify. Hazel Motes' idea of coherence is fitted with O'Connor and Williams. The idea here, the medieval purification, begins in their quest. And we're invited to join that as we study Charles Williams and O'Connor together. Thank you.